Now, our third and final topic for today. We started with Kenya in this episode of the Amanda Show, and we are ending with Kenya. Now, the biggest story on the continent in the past 2 weeks has been the protest in Kenya. It has painfully escalated to a situation of riots. I'm seeing looting. I'm seeing government buildings on fire. I'm seeing reports of protesters storming the houses of lawmakers. It's getting out of control. Quite all right. President William Ruto has made a U-turn on signing the tax reform bill. Many are saying that he may still go ahead to sign it, but for now he has made a U-turn. So we are hoping that stability returns to Kenya. But amid all the fire burning and all the chaos going on, there's something that many people are not talking about. And this is the role of the IMF in this protest. Now, we already know that Kenya is owing a lot of money. I believe Kenya is owing $80 billion. Very interesting. Why I said it's very interesting because it's 80 billion. This is all Kenya owes. And it's a big deal, it's a lot of money. But to think that there are some people in this world who are worth way more than 80 billion. 80 billion is setting the country on fire in Africa. But several people around the world are worth way more than 80 billion. Very interesting. Anyway, Kenya is owing $80 billion. And this is, I believe this is 65% of its GDP. Usually, the World Bank recommends 55%, 50-55% of GDP. That means don't owe more than 50 to 55% of your GDP, except you're the United States of America. You can owe, you can owe way over 100%. Japan also, but that's not the conversation for today. We're talking about Kenya. So Kenya's 80 billion is owed to institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and also China. So why I'm putting the blame on the IMF is because early this month, yes, this month of June, or was it May? Probably the ending of May, early June. Officials from the IMF visited Kenya and they had a conversation with the government, and they suggested that the government implement some tax reforms to be able to pay what they owe and service their debts. Now, the government agreed. This is what now led to the government proposing the tax reforms that pushed the people to the streets. Okay, now here's the thing that I want to talk about. The IMF suggested this thing, suggested that the way to be able to pay off what they owe and service their debts is to increase tax. I've seen a lot of reports blaming China. Yes, Kenya is owing China. I'm putting the large chunk of blame on the IMF. But before I double down on why I'm holding the IMF responsible, let me talk about Kenya. Let me talk about China. Now, Kenya is owing. This is an article on Voice of America that I'm going to lift a few quotes from. But I want to mention that Kenya is owing China $5.7 billion of its $80 billion owed. It's owing China $5.7 billion. Now, this is from an expert that the Voice of America spoke with, and the person's name is Gallagher. I'm trying to see if I can find the person's full name. I missed that, but the person's name is Gallagher, and he says, "Indeed, a quote. Indeed, the Kenyan case disproves accusations of debt trap diplomacy on the part of China. If China was doing debt trap diplomacy, it would be seizing Kenyan assets. Instead, Chinese capital has been the most patient during these rough times." Very interesting. Usually we hear the thing like, oh, debt trap, China is owing that with Africa, China is doing the whole debt trap diplomacy. But this person, this expert now, is saying that's not true. In this case, where Kenya has gotten to the end of its stick, it doesn't know what else to do, that it has to increase tax with the advice and the blessing of the IMF. Don't forget. In this case, that this is the best time for for China to come to say, good, since you can't pay me, give me this port, give me this airport, give me this infrastructure, give me this. Instead, China is not doing that. In fact, he went on to say that Chinese capital has been the most patient during these rough times. Interesting. Now, there is a former US diplomat, David Sheen. He says China is the largest bilateral lender, but its loans are quite modest when compared to the international financial institutions and holders of Eurobonds. So the problem is not China. Yes, $5.7 billion is not small money, but 80 billion odd, the real debt trap that Kenya is suffering is the IMF, World Bank, and the holders of Eurobond. This is why I blame the IMF. The IMF came in and insisted on the Kenyan government, insisted that the government increases tax on people who are already broke. Remember, this is will have been the third time that President William Ruto is increasing taxes on Kenyans. He came into power in 2022. He increased taxes in 2022. He increased taxes in 2023. This 2024 would have been the third time. Things have even gotten more expensive. Inflation is out of control in Kenya. And in this kind of economic situation, the IMF thought it was a good idea to come in to say the best way to solve this situation is to increase taxes. Interestingly, in the middle of this fire burning in Kenya, the IMF has even I'll find the link to all these things and I'll put it in the description so you can go and read for yourself. So in the middle of all this fire that is burning in Kenya, the IMF has still come out to say that the government should follow through on increasing taxes, which makes you begin to wonder what is the role of the IMF? What is the job of the IMF? What is it supposed to do? What we believe is it's supposed to help countries, with funds to help them develop and to do this and that, so that the countries can stand and become stronger. I don't think so. I believe if you've read that book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I believe the IMF is an economic hitman. The IMF doesn't put out fires, it starts it. It starts fires. In this situation where people have died, Kenya is literally on fire. In this situation, the IMF said, don't change your mind on increasing those taxes or follow through on it. It reminds me of what happened in Nigeria and Angola. The IMF came and told us in Nigeria that we need to remove fuel subsidies. Now, if you know anything about an economy, for economy to grow and to blossom, you need access to energy, and not just energy, cheap energy. Cheap energy. The IMF insisted that Nigeria remove subsidies. Now the argument was that Nigeria was spending a lot of money on subsidy. That if you allow the people to pay for the fuel subsidy, by the way, not just any subsidy, fuel subsidy. So if you allow the people to pay the real market value of fuel, that money you save, you can then put it into other parts of the economy. At the same time, here's what I think is very, very striking. At the same time, the IMF insisted that Nigeria floats the currency, so Nigeria should stop doing capital controls. Now, you can float a currency if you have a means of earning dollars, because the whole world we do transaction in dollars. So if you have a means of earning dollars, you can say, okay, we're not going to do that much capital control, right? But Nigeria, and like most other African nations, rely on imports. We're not really exporting finished goods. Most of countries in Africa, they just export raw materials. So that even at that situation, you're not going to be earning enough dollars to be able to continue your economic activities with, within the country and outside of the country. But the IMF insisted. Nigeria floated the naira. Nigeria removed subsidies, plunged the country into an economic mayhem. It completely, as we speak, it completely desecrated Nigeria's economy. It made it a joke. Nigeria was the number one economy in Africa, even as at 2015, 2014, 2015, before the last administration and this administration. Nigeria was well over $500 billion. It was projected to hit $1 trillion in a short time. GDP, by the way. But the IMF came in and did this. As we speak, Nigeria is number four economy, the fourth economy in Africa from number one. Why? And it went from over 500 billion. Nigeria is sitting at 200 and something billion GDP now. Why? How this IMF advice? I don't understand how at this point leaders of African countries have not realized that the IMF is not set up to benefit you. I don't understand how at this point African leaders have not realized that the IMF is not set up to benefit you. The IMF is set up to keep you poor. Because then if you're making an argument that is not set up to keep people, help me explain the kind of policies they champion in Africa. The only thing that the government is doing is to make energy cheap because the cheaper energy is, the more economic activities it encourages within the country. But when energy becomes expensive, it's it stalls the economy activity. Look at what's going on in Germany. Ever since they cut themselves off of cheap Russian gas, the prices of doing business in Germany has skyrocketed. Then imagine a country like, and this is Germany that has a lot of exports, like cars and the rest of them. Then imagine countries in Africa that don't have exports. They rely on imports. Why do they even rely on imports? Because of conditionalities the IMF imposed on them before taking loans. It's those conditionalities the IMF imposed on them before taking loans that has made many African countries reliant on imports. Now the IMF has set Kenya on fire and is still telling the Kenyan government to continue with the policy of increasing taxes, even when the country is burning. You tell me the IMF is set up for your good. Don't deceive yourself. So the question now becomes, what can President William Ruto and his government do about the situation in Kenya? If not, because he's saying that the only way that they can earn revenue is by increasing taxes. And I'm saying, no, that's not the only way. But the question is, what can they do? Number one, reduce the cost of governance. I have said this in the last episode I did when President William Ruto went to South Korea. I mentioned that all these foreign trips cost a lot of money. They are not cheap. Reduce the cost of governance. Reduce the size of the parliament. Right now, you are trying to squeeze money. Reduce the size of parliament. That is one thing they can do. And the IMF knows it. The IMF knows it, but they will not suggest it. But there's something else I want to read to you. This is also from an article from Voice of America, and it's talking about what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, what he said about back in April. He mentioned something about all these developing nations owing institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the rest of them. He said something. He said the world cannot afford to continue throwing developing countries' plans and futures onto a raging bonfire of debt. They say that around 40% of the world's population now live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on health or education. What is he saying? About 40% of the world's population and many of them in Africa, are living in countries that are spending more servicing debts, servicing money that you owe, compared to spending it on building, whether it's education or whether it's health, or even building their respective countries in general. This thing is not sustainable. This thing is not sustainable. Sometimes in a year, a country, particularly in Africa, they spend all they earn that year servicing debt. At the end of the day, there's nothing left to take care of the issues of the country. What do they then do? They go to take another debt. They go to take another loan. This cycle is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. I'm advocating that at this point, Africans should say we are not paying anymore. We are not paying. Because remember that many of these African nations, as the colonizers were leaving the countries, many of them were already trapped before they could do 5 years of independence. Some of them quite early, they were already trapped in debt. From 1950s to 1960s, when African countries were gaining so-called independence. I don't think they're independent, but anyway, were gaining so-called independence from European nations. By the 1970s, they were all in debt. So one of the reasons why Africa has not progressed economically, it looks like poverty. Africa is the headquarters of poverty in the world. Are policies like this? Why are we owing? Is all this everywhere? Oh. These institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, they were not set up to make you economically free. They were set up to keep Africa poor. And that's why I'm saying African leaders should say we're not paying anymore. What are the, please, if you know, let me know in the comment section below. What is the repercussion of not paying your debt? Maybe they will reduce your credit standing. After that, what else? What else? After that, think about it. They reduce our credit standing. Okay, after that, what else? Maybe I'm not so because I'm not so conversant on this situation of what happens if you don't pay. But let me know in the comment section below. Because at this point, Africa cannot continue like this. This system and this policy is not sustainable. We need to break away and extricate ourselves from this this crony system, this system of exploitation, this exploitative system. Africa needs to extricate itself and say no to the IMF and to the World Bank and oil countries all over the world.